Thanks so much for that introduction. You read it just like my mother wrote it. It's a tremendous honor to be here tonight, and I want to particularly thank Dean Rutherford for the opportunity to be here. This is a truly spectacular institution which in just such a short time is doing so much to develop the next generation of public service leaders in this country. I also want to thank Nikolai DePippa for developing what is a truly remarkable speaker series. When I was invited to participate in this, I immediately accepted because I knew the history. Even though this institution isn't particularly old, it already has a tremendous reputation for its speaker series. So I'm deeply honored to be able to participate in that. I don't want to speak overly long tonight, in part because one thing that I want to be able to do is take your questions and have some discussion. As was mentioned by Dean Rutherford, this is actually a very interesting time to be speaking about digital diplomacy, what Secretary of State Clinton calls 21st century statecraft, because it seems like every single solitary day there is some remarkable disruption that is taking place by virtue of the increasing ubiquity and the increasing power of connection technologies. And when I say connection technologies, I mean everything from social media, like Facebook and Twitter, to the smartphones, mobile phones, to internet. So when I say connection technologies, I mean that as sort of a catch-all for all of it. So first, 21st century statecraft. When Hillary Clinton had accepted the president's invitation to serve in his cabinet, and she testified before the United States Senate, she described a world in which the promise and peril of the 21st century was no longer bound by vast distances and national borders. And when she said that, part of what she was speaking to was how technology was making the world much, much smaller. And part of what she was also speaking to was that the way that our statecraft, the way that our foreign policy has been organized, not just for years, but literally for centuries, is being completely disrupted. You know, it's going back to the time that Thomas Jefferson was Secretary of State, America's first Secretary of State. The bread and butter of the American diplomat has been the formal interactions between sovereign nation states, government to government. You know, one person in a suit and tie talking to another with flags flying in the background, determining the relationships between their governments. That continues to be at the core of our statecraft, but one of the things that we've seen in the 21st century is that that has been wildly disrupted. And it's been disrupted notably, I would say, by three things. Number one, changing demographics. It's increasingly the case the world around that there is a spike, what's being called a youth bulge, where if you go into a given country, particularly in the developing world, it's not unusual for 55, 60, 65, nearly 70% of the population to be under 30. That's disruption one. Disruption two is the changing gender roles the world around. So it's increasingly the case that women are breaking through the glass ceilings that have held them back for years. Another disruption goes to the increasing power and changing nature of diaspora networks. So migration patterns the world around are changing things. And then the final significant disruption, and the one that I spend most of my time personally focusing on, goes to technology. If you think about some of the major organizing principles of literally centuries of history rooted in infrastructure, mass media, and communications, what we're seeing is that a lot of these things now are all coalescing around the same platform. If you think about infrastructure, for example, the means of economic transport, 18th century infrastructure was ports. 19th century infrastructure was railroads. 20th century infrastructure was highways. 21st century infrastructure are these broadband networks, the internet. Think about mass media and go back 100 years. 100 years ago, the newspaper was the dominant form of mass media. Then it became radio. Then it became television. Now, it's the internet. Think about communications. Go back 150 years. What have been the paradigm shifts? First, it was the handwritten letter. Then it was the telegraph. Then it was the telephone. Now, it's the internet. So we're seeing all of these paradigm shifts take place, any one of which is significant, but they're all now running over this common IP, Internet Protocol infrastructure. And this is something that's largely taken root over the last 10 years. This is difficult to read, but what I'll simply say is what this shows is that just in the last 10 years, just in the time post-dating Bill Clinton being president, there's been a 500% increase in the number of people using the internet and a 500% increase in the number of people using mobile phones the world around. And so what does this increasing ubiquity of connection technologies mean? What it does is it creates what I refer to as network dynamics. And these network dynamics are what are so wildly disruptive for both good and ill. And I'll give some examples of how it's been wildly disruptive for positive and how it's been wildly disruptive for negative. One way in which we've seen these network dynamics be used for good was actually in the hours after the earthquake in Haiti. The earthquake in Haiti took place just before 5 p.m., sort of late afternoon, early evening. And Secretary of State Clinton at that point she was about to travel from Hawaii to Papua New Guinea. She never made it to Papua New Guinea. She had to come back home to respond to the earthquake. But one of the things that she wanted to have happen was by the time people had that first cup of coffee in the morning, the next day, and were hearing about what had happened in Haiti for the first time, she wanted people to be able to do something right then. How can we get the American people directly involved and engaged in responding to the tragedy in Haiti? And so with that task, a handful of 30-something-year-old diplomats, just most of whom didn't have big titles or a lot of power or big names or great reach, said, well, let's work with our friends and partners to develop a program so that we can take something that's ubiquitous and normally pretty ridiculous, a text message, and let's turn this into a powerful fundraising vehicle. And so what we did is we set up a program where by texting the word Haiti to text message short code 90999, every time you texted the word Haiti, a $10 donation would be made to the Red Cross. And we thought that this could raise tens of thousands of dollars, if not hundreds of thousands of dollars. And so what we did is this, again, small group of 30-something-year-old diplomats, we began to think about our networks and thinking about how we thought about how we might be able to build an entire campaign around this Text Haiti initiative. And we're thinking about what it would take to make something viral. And so what we did is using social media, using things like Twitter and Facebook, we built out networks of networks where suddenly, like a spider web, the number of people who are engaging in this without having heard about it through the mainstream media absolutely exploded. And in a little over 2 weeks, about $35 million was raised in $10 increments, $10 donations. More than 3 million Americans made donations. And this was all made possible by some young diplomats figuring out sort of the dark arts of social media and how to exploit networks of networks. And, you know, this was obviously used to wonderful effect. But we can, and one of the key learnings from my standpoint from this is that processing and distribution power has devolved from large mass media organizations to individuals and small institutions, and has done so in a variety of different ways. Another example, these pictures are from a Facebook account in Syria. Now, Syria is one of the most closed and most oppressive countries on planet Earth. And I took a trip to Syria with 5 companies with a combined market cap of more than $500 billion last year with a thesis. And the thesis in part was that we weren't going to make a lot of progress necessarily with the Ba'athist government, with the al-Assads, with a government who, over the course of literally 4 decades, the United States had made minimal, very minimal progress. And I personally believed that the sanctions that we had in place were right and are right. But one area where it actually worked against our interests a little bit was not allowing American technology in. Because if we wanted to influence the next generation of Syrians, if in a country where the population was going to double in less than 20 years, if we wanted those young people who are dynamic, who are resourceful, to be influenced by somebody other than the imams and the Ba'athist government, well, then it seems like American technology and American tools that facilitate the free flow of information would be in our interest. And so we have made some reversals where we're saying, you know what, American technology being accessible in the closed environment that is Syria is a good thing. And within 90 days of our getting back from Damascus, one of the things that was very interesting to see was what I believe to be the first ever successful human rights campaign, citizen-centered human rights campaign in 40 years of Ba'athist rule. And it was made possible because of Facebook. What happened is some students took videos using their cell phone of teachers beating students. And they created a Facebook campaign calling on the government to punish the teachers. Now, normally, 40 years of precedent would suggest that anybody making any sorts of demands of the government is going to jail. But it very quickly became the case that 5,000 Syrians got behind this campaign, and it became clear that nobody could figure out who was behind it. It was sort of a leaderless movement with 5,000 people associated with it. So the Syrian government had a choice. It could either A, punish the teachers for what was a very obvious case of wrongdoing, I will do you a favor and not show you the videos, or B, it could retaliate against literally 5,000 people. What did it do? It punished the teachers. So for the first time, the distributed power of technology made an act against a closed government possible. Now, what I should immediately say is that it's very important at this point to not be utopian. You can't just sprinkle Facebook, you can't just sprinkle the internet on a challenge and you know, democracy springs forth. That's incredibly naive. And it's incredibly naive in an environment like Syria, where yes, something like this kind of a human rights campaign is possible, but we also need to be mindful that it is very easy for these governments to infiltrate, monitor, and surveil their citizens, and for them to break up the kinds of movements and the kinds of efforts, and to arrest people who they do identify as organizers of such things. I wanted to take the opportunity tonight to pick one country that I think is illustrative of a number of the dynamics in foreign policy right now as it relates to technology. And it's just something very current, something that happened up to literally just last week, and that's Tunisia. For those of you who aren't familiar, Tunisia is a country that for the past several decades had an authoritarian government in place, the Ben Ali regime. And until literally just a couple weeks ago, to all public appearances, the government of Tunisia had literally a vice grip on its people. And then on December 17th, a young man, frustrated by the lack of economic opportunity he had, an educated young man, literally lit himself on fire as a protest against the lack of economic opportunity in Tunisia. So on December 17th in a city called Sidi Abu Zaid. And what played out over literally just 5 weeks from the time that that young man set himself on fire was a government being totally and completely and fully entrenched in its society to being out of power and the ruler on a plane for Saudi Arabia for exile. And there's been an enormous amount of speculation about the role of technology in this. Technology was a very interesting and important part of what has taken place in Tunisia, and with the unrest that's taking place literally today in Egypt, and much of what's being looked at elsewhere in the region, there are lots of questions now about, is technology going to play a significantly disruptive role throughout the Middle East and perhaps more broadly? And so what I wanted to share tonight was my synthesis of this. And I wanted to share 2 things that I believe technology did not do in Tunisia, and 6 things that I believe technology did do in Tunisia. And I think that a great many lessons can be drawn from this. So first of all, let me say what technology did not do in Tunisia. Connection technologies did not start the uprising. This uprising was not about social media. It was about factors like youth unemployment, surging food prices, and displeasure with the ruling family. That is what this rebellion was about. It was also not a Twitter revolution. A lot of people have been saying, was this the first ever successful Twitter revolution? A revolution either made possible or made successful by the use of tools like Twitter. I would say no. So these, I think, are 2 things that technology did not do in Tunisia. I would argue, though, that there are 6 things that technology did do. Number 1, connection technology succeeded where mainstream media failed or were slow to report news. So what happened is after this young man caught himself on fire in a city called Sidi Abu Zaid, there's something on Twitter called a hashtag where people are able to follow a common conversation or a common topic. And the Ben Ali regime controlled the broadcast media in Tunisia. And so it was not in the interests of the regime for there to be a lot of reporting about what had happened. But because people had the outlet of social media and things like Twitter, even though there wasn't any conventional mainstream media reporting the news, it still got around, and it got around throughout Tunisian society. And eventually, mainstream media, things, and particularly France 24 and Al Jazeera, did pick up on the news. And frankly, because they oftentimes didn't have reporters, because mainstream media oftentimes didn't have reporters in Tunisia, they just pulled straight from Facebook. They pulled straight from some of the social media and used that as the reporting. Number 2, connection technologies and social media can make weak ties stronger. What do I mean by that? What I mean by that is that the connections between people that can sometimes be very light. The research is now showing, and Pew just came out with a study that said that people are more likely to connect and engage substantively offline if they're also connecting on things that they care about online. And one of the things that we saw in Tunisia was that weak ties between people, the movement making, was made much stronger in part because of social media. Another key learning, any movement involving youth or younger people, and when I say youth or younger people, I mean under 40. I'm 39 now, and the older I get, the older young becomes in my mind. Every movement that involves people under 40 is going to have technology as a key component. So in my opinion, I don't care where you are on planet Earth right now, there are not technology movements or youth movements as separate and distinct things. That is a false distinction. Every rebellion, every movement is going to have a technology component to it. Next, younger people under 40, one thing we learned from Tunisia is they view access to the internet and access to an uncensored internet as a human right. One of the things that most infuriated the Tunisian people was when the Tunisian government, amidst the protests, hacked everybody's Facebook accounts and started shutting down websites. And in fact, in the last night that he was in power, when Ben Ali made this very passionate plea to the Tunisian people and said, "I have heard the Tunisian people, I'm going to take the blocks off the internet." I mean, it's interesting to me that, you know, the guy is trying to hold on for one last gasp, and one of the big things that he throws out there, and one of the things that he says, "I heard the Tunisian people," had to do with this access to the internet. Number 5, connection technologies act as accelerants. So if you remember what I was saying a few minutes ago, this wasn't a Twitter revolution. This movement was not made possible or made successful by connection technologies, but it was made faster. If you think about movement building, if you think about rebellions, if you think about revolutions, there usually are at a minimum months and normally years of organizing that takes place. I mean, think about dissent movements. Think about how many meetings under cover of night in basements tend to take place. Think about the ties that have to be built. Think about the organizing that needs to be done. One of the things that's fascinating, that's a learning from Tunisia, is that because of the open platforms, things that normally would have taken 6, 12, or 18 months took 5 weeks. So it's fascinating. Movement building can go from 0 to 60 like that. But going back to not being utopian, the fact that this movement building is taking place over open platforms, again, it makes it easier for an intelligence service, for a government to infiltrate, monitor, surveil. Infiltrate, monitor, manipulate. So if these open platforms allow people to connect and organize and to make weak ties stronger, that can also be exploited by governments. And it's very interesting to think that if there hadn't been a change of power in the last 10 days in Tunisia, would the Ben Ali government have used its ability to infiltrate, monitor, and manipulate these open platforms as a way of exploiting its people? So it's important to not be utopian. These open platforms are incredibly powerful, but they can also be wielded by governments in incredibly malignant ways. So I use this example of Tunisia as a way of coming back to this issue of disruption. These networks disrupt for good, and they also disrupt for ill. You know, I think it's worth mentioning WikiLeaks at this point. WikiLeaks it's interesting in that it is an almost entirely virtual organization. to my knowledge, it doesn't necessarily have a street address, paid staff, and a suite number, a phone number that you can call. It's a distributed organization. It is a networked organization that, because of global communications networks, is able to distribute cables in a way that is exceedingly difficult to stop. So the same power that's given to a couple of 30-somethings that enables them to build a text messaging campaign that raises $35 million, that those same sets of network dynamics puts tools in the hands of people who have completely different intentions in mind. So it's interesting, if you think about the network dynamics, it's individuals and small institutions becoming empowered at the expense of the nation state and of large institutions. And technology itself is value neutral. It takes on it is inanimate until a human being bends it to his or her own intentions. So while we can feel very good and very excited about diplomats raising $35 million for earthquake relief in Haiti, the same network dynamics can be used to disrupt and try to attack American diplomacy. So in the face of this disruption, what then do we do? Do we batten down the hatches, or do we try to harness these networks in service of our diplomatic and development goals? I think the president said it best when he was at the United Nations this past fall, where he said the strongest foundation for human progress lies in open economies, open societies, and open governments. What that means is that to the maximum extent possible, we need to recognize that our global communications networks, all of these technology tools, are making more information, more data, and more processing and distribution power available to individuals the world around. And what we need to do is figure out how we can harness it for positive educational outcomes, for positive economic outcomes, for positive societal outcomes, without being utopian, while being open-eyed about how, as Hillary Clinton has said it, technology can contribute to both the promise and peril of the 21st century. She likened all of this technology to nuclear power, which she said could fuel a city or destroy a city. And it's with that we are building our 21st century statecraft agenda, recognizing that there is an inevitability about this technology. There is an inevitability that people are going to become increasingly connected. There's an inevitability that our economies become increasingly networked. And in the face of this change, in the face of this disruption, the onus is on our leaders and on our diplomats to adapt with the times. So with that, I'm very happy to take any questions you have and engage in some discussion. So please, your most uncensored questions.
If you raise your hand, we'll get a microphone to you. Right there.
Hello, thank you so much for being here. My name is Spencer Locker, and I'm a first-year student here at the Clinton School. My question is, to what extent is there a concern that this focus on 21st century statecraft is alienating the older population?
Yeah, when you mean the older population, do you mean...
I guess 41 up,
by
your standards.
Yeah, no, when you mean the older population, do you mean older diplomats or older citizens the world around?
Both, I guess. Because, I mean,
Okay.
I guess it increases training necessities for older diplomats.
So there are a couple things. I mean, first of all, I do think that, you know, I have a 94-year-old grandmother who's now on Facebook. So I think we need to not be too presumptuous about the degree to which all of these technologies are rooted in a specific generation. There was a terrific article in the Washington Post on Sunday about P.J. Crowley, who spent 20-some-odd years in the Air Force and then at the White House, and he's our Assistant Secretary of State for Public Affairs, and he's a lot better at Twitter than I am. And so, you know, first of all, I would say that the aptitude and affinity for these technologies does not live exclusively within younger generations. It is the case that younger people more likely than not grew up with it. I mean, I'm 39 years old. When I was in college, I didn't send or receive a single email. I didn't own a cell phone until I was 28 years old. I personally am 15 years removed from being a digital native. So we have to recognize that different generations have had different degrees of technology sort of at the core of their lives. I'll speak to the diplomats first. When I came to the State Department, one of the things that I feared was just by virtue of having the title Senior Advisor for Innovation, that there were going to be a lot of pissed off older diplomats. And you know what? That is absolutely, positively not proven to be true. You know, I think that the Foreign Service is, in my opinion, one of the most vaunted a Foreign Service officer is one of the most vaunted public servants. And what does a Foreign Service officer want? A Foreign Service officer wants to be able to serve his or her country. And every smart Foreign Service officer recognizes that connection technologies are increasingly relevant in their workplace. And so as Hillary Clinton introduced this 21st century statecraft agenda into the State Department, it's been extremely warmly received because our diplomats want to be relevant. And one thing that I have heard time and time and time again, I can't tell you how many times, is that our diplomats oftentimes felt emasculated before Hillary Clinton became Secretary of State, because they felt as though diplomacy had somehow become a subsidiary of the Defense Department. And so by reasserting the primacy of diplomacy and by giving our diplomats these tools, we're strengthening them. And so that's what I've seen. In terms of the general population, you know, I don't know that we're necessarily alienating people. It's important for us to not say, okay, we live in a digital world, so we're only doing internet stuff now. I mean, the vast majority of diplomacy is unchanged. And, you know, I think it's very important that we not try to lead with technology. This is about foreign policy. It's not about technology. I was a history major. I don't care about technology in and of itself. I care about foreign policy and about foreign policy outcomes. So if we're working with a population where using some of these tools isn't a solution to a problem, then we shouldn't be pushing technology as a solution. Next question.
Hi, thank you again for coming. I'm Jessie Rice, also a student at the Clinton School here. I could relate to your Tunisia example, actually. I just read in the newspaper that the interim government closed down a TV station, and it caused a lot of discredit towards the new government in power with the citizens. And so that begged the question to me, what's this relationship between the older media, TVs, newspapers, books, and this new media that's popping up? Is it going to take over?
That's a great question. So the answer is that it's not about one media form taking over another. It's about the information environment changing. So in Tunisia, for example, what we saw was social media, blogs, combining with satellite TV, things like Al Jazeera, to change the information environment in a country. I think that we are living in, you know, what in sort of digital hipster speak is a multi-platform world. where people are getting information from quote-unquote traditional media like newspapers and TV, but they're also getting things constantly streamed into their mobile phones. They've got RSS feeds, they've got social media. So part of what's happening right now is a level almost of information saturation, media overload that's beginning to take place. And so the filtering mechanisms that are going to be used to deal with this information saturation are going to be really interesting. But what I think is the case is that it's not that one media form is replacing another. It's that the information environment and the balance of power, so to speak, is changing. So weekly magazines, for example, you know, when I was growing up in the 1970s and 1980s, you know, the Time magazine, the Newsweek, the U.S. News and World Report, that once-a-week magazine that you'd get on your doorstep, that was the authoritative source of news that supplemented the morning newspaper and the evening newscast. I'm not saying that any of those are irrelevant. What I'm saying is that their relative power and influence in the market has lessened as we now have a more distributed media environment. It's a more distributed and a more complex media environment now.
Thank you. Are you a Foreign Service officer? And secondly, can you name any examples where Julian Assange's disclosures of the cables and email messages have significantly hindered United States policy objectives, foreign policy objectives, or security situation?
Sure. And so, number one, I'm not a Foreign Service officer. I am a political appointee. Number two, I'm going to bust out some of my favorite words right now: active, ongoing Department of Justice investigation. There is an active, ongoing Department of Justice investigation at the moment, so I'm significantly constrained in terms of what I can say about WikiLeaks and about Mr. Assange. So I can respond with some generalities, but unfortunately not specifically to your question. I apologize, but I'm not in the mood to antagonize the Justice Department.
1 second.
So in addition to using this sort of a technique to raise money, how is our State Department deploying the use of this technology?
Yeah, so there are a great many examples. So I'll give you 3 more, okay? So here's one program that we've developed. We have an enormous problem right now in the border region with Mexico. The level of violence in some of these Mexican cities like Ciudad Juarez, are completely out of control. And in Ciudad Juarez, a city that's literally suffered from thousands of homicides in recent years because of the drug cartels, one of the things that has been lost is trust between the population and its police force. People will not walk up the literal or proverbial steps of the station house because they're afraid that they're going to get shot in the head as an act of retribution. So one program that we are putting in place is we are leveraging the technology capacity that we have in the United States to put a program in place in Ciudad Juarez, which we then hope will be a model for the rest of Mexico, where citizens will be able to anonymously report crime. So they can send crime reports, but the crime reports are encrypted, and the personally identifiable information is visible only to a very few individuals. And the idea is to try to create anonymity, transparency, and accountability back in crime reporting in Mexico. So there's one example. A second example goes to the East Congo. In my opinion, one of the hardest places on planet Earth to work. Some estimates say that more than 50% of the women above age 18 in the East Congo have been subject to sexual and gender-based violence. It's unlike anything I and others have ever encountered. And there is no functional judicial system in the East Congo. None. The distance between Kinshasa in the west and the center of the sexual violence in the east is the geographic distance between Chicago and Washington. But it's the difference between Chicago and Washington without functional roads and without commercial air traffic. So it might as well be in a different universe. And the courts are in Kinshasa. And so what we're trying to do, one program that we're trying to put in place right now is literally using very straightforward broadband technology as a way of creating a virtual court system so that a woman doesn't have to go to Kinshasa to be able to participate in a judicial and a legal process. That's thing two. What's an interesting one for thing three? For thing three, we're focusing, another thing that we're focusing on right now is landmines in Colombia. One of the great successes, in my opinion, of American foreign policy in the last decade plus has been the shift of Colombia from, the partnership with the nation of Colombia, where Colombia went from being almost a failed state, a complete narco state, to a place which today is completely thriving. I mean, Medellin, Colombia, is a beautiful, thriving city. And we have, one of the programs that we're focusing right now is using technology to break down the last remnants of the guerrilla movement in Colombia, which is focused on landmines. And so we are using sophisticated mapping technologies and other things to put programs in place so that in areas that are very heavily trafficked with landmines, we have an information awareness system so that people know what to avoid, and when they do find landmines, they can report them. So there are three quick examples.
Right there.
Thank you so much for coming. I'm Alana Bell. I am a first-year student at the Clinton School. We're glad to have you. I don't expect you to have an answer, but I'd like to have your opinion. You talked a lot about, of course, we've been watching Tunisia and now Cairo, social media being an accelerant.
Mm-hmm.
One of the things about a movement that's slow is it goes deep. This is fast, but not necessarily deep. How is that going to affect governments? You know, there's no one to come to power. There's a lot of unhappy people. So
That sounds like a great question for a thesis.
Would you like to write it?
Yeah.
Don't line me up for it right now. Okay?
Nobody has an answer to that yet because we're just seeing this take place now for the first time. But I'll tell you what I think is going to be the case. If movements that would have once taken years now take 6 weeks, part of what happens is that the movements themselves will be more leaderless. You know, one thing that I've said that I believe to be true is that the Che Guevara of the 21st century is the network. It's going to be less often the case that there's some charismatic revolutionary leader out there organizing the masses for change, but rather, as was the case in Tunisia, that again, power and organizing is more distributed. It's less hierarchical. So that something can happen and you can then ask yourself the question, okay, who's in charge? And as you yourself said, things that take a long time then have a level of depth that something that took place in 5 weeks doesn't have. So what I think that is going to then lend itself to is a measure of considerable chaos. And I think that this can be incredibly disruptive in environments where there isn't necessarily going to be a George Washington and a Thomas Jefferson ready to stand in and set up a new government. I think we need to question the motives of lots of people who would involve themselves in different kinds of movements, and sometimes maybe there'll be a George Washington and a Thomas Jefferson behind it, and other times maybe there'll be somebody who's extreme, maybe there'll be individuals and institutions that are extremely hostile to American interests. But one thing that I do think this lends itself to is a measure of chaos. You know, something that goes from start to finish in 5 weeks with no hierarchy, with no leadership, is then more exploitable, both for good and for ill.
I do. 1 second.
Hello. More new technology here. My question, ultimately, when I get to it, will be 2 parts. I'm talking about, and I'll preface it by saying, when someone invented the machine gun, they talked about how horrible of an instrument it was because it killed so many people. And you take that argument through tanks, airplane bombs, et cetera, all the way up to nuclear war. And there was a response that I read that, you know, the nuclear weapon didn't do anything that the bow and arrow did. It just did it faster to more people, which is consistent with what you said about the internet, it acting as an accelerant. Clearly, you've given a couple of examples where the accelerant has done some good, and most of us, I imagine, in this room would argue that the first use of the atom bomb did some good as well, but then it became a deterrent. People decided, gee whiz, maybe we shouldn't use this thing anymore. Is it possible, and maybe the WikiLeaks leak being kind of some of an omen, that this accelerant might prove to be too dangerous? I think you touched on it a little bit earlier. Too dangerous as a tool to use for some of the things that you're discussing. And then secondly, maybe a corollary in some respect to, you know, being a nuclear power and having such power is that your enemy now begins to engage you in different ways, because while we talk about how horrible it is that we have the terrorists, we also know that, gee whiz, terrorists aren't totally stupid. They know they can't take on the United States and head up a war, so they will find another avenue. What will be the avenue to deal with the accelerant that the internet provides?
So fundamentally, those are great questions. Fundamentally, the difference in this case between the Cold War construct of nuclear power and the 21st century construct of connection technologies is that the ability to actually exercise nuclear might was constrained to a very small number of nation states. Whereas today, in a world of 7 billion people, that, you know, power is remarkably distributed. So it's not like the Cold War where there could be some sense of engagement between, say, the United States, the USSR, and our respective satellite states. There is an inevitability, whether we like it or not, there is an inevitability to the increasing ubiquity and the increasing power of connection technologies. You know, I would argue that what it makes possible in terms of economic empowerment, in terms of educational empowerment, in terms of communications, far outweighs potential negatives. But we do have to be mindful of the negative. And if you do say, all right, you know, the ability to significantly disrupt a government can now be done by a handful of guys with a send button on their computer, the question becomes, in part, do you batten down the hatches or do you go on offense? Do you try to recognize the disruption but then harness these things in service of our goals? I personally believe that sort of battening down the hatches isn't going to work. You know, without getting into specifics, I think that, you know, it's clearly the case that the distributed nature of power in a digital environment makes it very difficult to be defensive. Now, we do put enormous defensive measures in place, and we have a U.S. Cyber Command, and we are, you know, putting, you know, programs in place to defend our networks as best we can, and we can and should continue to do that. But that defense cannot overwhelm our hopes and intentions for the internet and for connection technologies to be a force for good. You know, what we're in is an environment of extreme complexity. And if you're being very clear-eyed about such things, you're recognizing the good that comes with the bad. I don't think anybody has the perfect answer to your question because I don't think anybody's able to see perfectly into the future. But what you're describing and what your question goes to is a situation of enormous complexity. You know, a senior member of the State Department said to me not long ago, if I were a graduate student, one of the things that would be most interesting to study is cybersecurity, because cybersecurity today is sort of like the development of nuclear policy in the 1950s. It's an incredibly complex and evolving landscape with huge implications.
We have time for one more, right there.
Last question.
It's coming. One of them will get to you.
Thank you. Sharon Welch Blair. I am a neighborhood activist. And one of the things that I've noticed that has been very disturbing about the internet, and by the way, I own an iPhone, so I am in the 21st century. But it seems that in the era that we're in now, we may not have as much ability to determine what's accurate and what's not accurate as a result of this. And I'll give you an example of that. The seeming inability for us to refute the fact that over and over and over and over, people believe Barack Obama is not an American citizen. And it's taken on a life of its own. And my concern is that over a period of time, we get to the point where we don't really have an authority to determine what's right and what's wrong. How do we deal with that?
Yeah, that's a great question. And, you know, I hate to keep coming back and saying there are remarkably positive aspects and remarkably negative aspects to this, but it's interesting. Think about, let's take Barack Obama. Barack Obama is president in part because of how intelligently he and his campaign used the internet for his campaign. Brilliant. So he's president in part because he figured out how to use the internet. Conversely, a series of absolutely ridiculous myths are out there. Oh, he's not an American. Oh, he's a Muslim. Oh, he's this. Oh, he's that. And so the power that he has been given, in part because of the internet, is mitigated by the fact that any idiot who can hit send on his or her computer suddenly has an audience for it. And so the onus really comes on us. This is where you can't take human beings out of this. We as human beings need to continue to use our good human sense about what is good content and what is bad content. And that is why, I, to this day, when I read the newspaper, I might read the newspaper on the internet, but I read the Washington Post, I read the New York Times, why do I read the Washington Post and the New York Times? Because even though they don't get it right 100% of the time, I know that they're going to get it right more often than they're wrong, and I know that there are going to be some significant journalistic standards that go into anything that they publish. So with all of this technology, we can't take out the humanity. We can't take out our good sense. And as a father to young children, I've got an 8-year-old, a 6-year-old, and a 3-year-old. And my 8-year-old, my 6-year-old, my 3-year-old are going to grow up in a wildly different information environment than the one that I did growing up in West Virginia. I mean, growing up in West Virginia, my mom would open up the back door, I'd run out the back door, I'd play with my friends, I'd show up when I got hungry, which was around lunchtime, I'd eat, I'd run back outside, I'd come back when I was hungry again, which was around dinner time. And, it was a little bit a different world then than it is today. Today, these kids are constantly plugged in. And the amount of information, some of which I never want my children's eyes to see, but which they inevitably will, puts an onus on people. It puts an onus on me as a parent to understand and help them understand the information that they're consuming that's going to be coming at them from 500 different directions, from 500 different devices. So whether it's you as a neighborhood activist trying to get good information and good resources to the neighborhood that you seek to serve, or me as a parent of children that are going to grow up in a different information environment, one of the key lessons with all of this technology is you cannot take away the role of humanity and of good common sense. Thank you all. It's been an honor to be here tonight.